Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Cosmic Connection. Today's topic is water world, and we're going to be talking about Mars and Neptune in Pisces and Mercury retrograde in Cancer, amongst probably many other things, but we're going to start there. I am Amanda Pua Walsh. I'm the founder of Astrology Hub, and I'm here with the Merlin, Rick Levine. Rick, love your flower today.
I just want to be like you when I grow up.
You're looking great. Okay, so let's talk about this water world.
Well, this water world. Well, let's start off with the fact that we've really misnamed our planet. I mean, that's a good place to start. If we were going to name our planet correctly, we would be living on the planet water, not the planet Earth, because there's less Earth on the planet than there is water. As we know, water covers almost 2/3 of the surface of the planet. And if you don't believe me, go to Google Earth and spin it around until you have Hawaii on the upper right and Australia and Fiji and and those on the bottom left, and you'll realize that you can make a picture that where one half of the Earth, not the half that we normally see in maps, but that half of it has no land in it at all. And so the fact of the matter is that water is important. Now, astrologically, we have 4 elements, and those elements do correspond with the 4 suits in the tarot, and that's not an accident, because they both derive from the ancient Greek concepts of actually 5 elements, but the 5th element we put out here. We'll come back to that in a moment. And incidentally, this is also the basis of what we moderners call Jungian psychology. And I always like to point out that Jung didn't call his work Jungian psychology any more than Buddha called his teachings Buddhism, or Christ called his teachings Christianity, or Freud called his teachings Freudianism. You know, Freud called his teachings psychoanalysis. And Jung called his teachings analytical psychology. That's what it was. Jung created this body of knowledge called analytical psychology, which he referred to as the psychology of 4 types. He made no bones about it at all that he got that from the Greeks, where they had the 4 humors, and the 4 humors were about the body and healing. Remember, Jung was a medical doctor. I mean, as was Freud. They were doctors. And I mean, real, quote unquote, real medical doctors, not PhD doctors, which I have a friend who's Bruce Lipton says, MDs are money doctors and PhDs are piled higher and deeper. But Jung makes no bones about the fact that his psychology of 4 types comes from the 4 humors of the Greeks, which were wet, dry, hot, cold. Those are actually combinations of the 4 elements: fire, earth, air, and water. That's where that all comes from. And in the Jungian construct, there is a 1-to-1 correspondence between his psychology of 4 types, which were thinking, feeling, intuiting, and perceiving. And I'll say those slower in just a moment, because some people might recognize those words as 4 of the 8 words associated with the Myers-Briggs. So Myers-Briggs, the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, actually directly derives from Jung's psychology of 4 types, which directly derives from the Greeks' 4 elements, really 5 elements, but we'll come back to the 5th in just a moment. And those elements are fire, earth, air, and water. Fire, according to, well, let me say one other thing before I say what the elements are specifically in meaning. Jung's psychology of 4 types was built upon the premise that everyone favors 1 or 2 of the 4 types in how their personality moves through lives, and everyone tends to unfavor 1 or 2 of those four types. So we have someone who might be a thinking kind of person. We might call that person an ectomorph. You know, the Ichabod Cranes, the intellectual teachers with long fingernails and thin body types, and that's a thinking person. And then we might have a feeling person. So thinking corresponds to air in astrology. Feeling in the Jungian system corresponds to emotions, feelings, emotions, water. Earth has to do with direct sensation, with perception, perceiving things. And fire, and this is an interesting one for many astrologers, has to do with intuition. We tend to think of Pisces or the water signs as intuitive because that's what feelings are. But feelings and intuition are slightly different in the Jungian construct because feelings always connect to something that happened in the past. That's what feelings do. Feelings are a way of sensing something in the body that corresponds it to some emotion, that this is something I should be afraid of, this is something I like, whatever. Okay. Intuition, however, is how fire survives. Intuition is the direct experience. There's no putting the cause and effect together. There's no thinking about it. There's not even a real sensation. Fire just knows how to burn to keep itself going. And that's intuition. It's the direct engagement. So we have this one-to-one correspondence in astrology to these four elements: fire, earth, air, water. And we can run through, and I'll do this very quickly, but it helps us understand where we're going with water world, our topic today. Because the fire signs are Aries, which is the fire starter. Cardinal signs start. Aries is the fire starter. It initiates. Leo is the fire sustainer. It's the fixed fire sign. So that keeps the fire going. That has to do with the expression and the, and the consistency of the action. Actions are basically, we act. This is the old, acting before thinking. That's perfect fire. And then Sagittarius is the mutable or changeable fire sign, where it is still fire, but it's actually moving into another realm, and the fire is far away. I mean, Aries is the bonfire that just flares and then it's gone. Leo is the eternal light, the Ner Tamid in the Jewish tradition, the eternal light that is maintained. Certainly, it is the light that the temple keepers, that Vesta and the temple priestesses kept going in the temple. So that's the eternal light. And then Sagittarius is like the light of the distant stars that becomes an idea, the idea of fellowship, the idea of love. And it takes it and kind of takes that fire and almost moves it into maybe even an airy realm. That's the fire signs. The earth signs, which are practical, in Jung's terminology, had to do with direct sensation or perception. Taurus, if you can't see it, kick it, walk around it, bang your hand against it, it ain't real, which is why Taurus has to do with the touchy-feely and the sensations, and the, nice towels and nice sheets and good food and good wine and even good music. These things are all direct sensation. And I know Taurus is more than that, but I'm cherry picking here to make my point. The next earth sign would be Virgo, and Virgo is, so Taurus is the fixed earth. Virgo is the mutable earth, which again is changing into something else. And again, Virgo is the least earthy on some level of the earth signs because it's Mercury related, and it also has to do, it's like a thinking process. But unlike air sign Gemini, Virgo is thinking that leads to something real. It has to be useful. It has to be practical. It has to be down to earth. And of course, even Virgo as the earth maiden, is also, there is a sensuality, but it's a reserved and cautious and careful sensuality. But that Virgo energy is very powerfully sexual, except it is in a very cautious and careful and restrained manner, which is why Virgos get the bum rap of being labeled prudes. It just means that if you think of Virgo as a prude, it just means you haven't had the glory of having experienced that Virgo energy, because they are narrow beamed, they are narrowly focused. And then the third earth sign is Capricorn, and I'll try to be nice here because I know you are one of those. But Capricorn is also earth because it has to do with that which is real. Compared with its opposite sign, Cancer, which is a water sign, Capricorn, instead of wanting to protect its feelings on the inside, Capricorn deals with the feelings on the inside by mastering the outside. And so there's, again, a direct interaction in what one perceives in the outer world. Capricorn is also very earthy. It's very sense driven. But here the senses have been redirected from personal touchy-feely, like in Taurus, from the earthiness of the analytical Virgo. It's been redirected into accomplishment in the outer world. Doesn't mean it's the other's not there. It just means it's been largely redirected. So we've done fire, earth, air. The three air signs are Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. And air as an element, according to Jung, is about thinking. It's the thought process. Gemini is the thought process that connects any two dots. Give me two pieces of information, the Gemini will connect it. I think of the consummate Gemini, Bob Dylan, who in his latest album, which is not yet released, but a song has been released on it. There's a song on there that you can find on YouTube. The name of the song is "I Contain Multitudes." And that is a line, maybe even the opening line, of fellow Gemini Walt Whitman, who wrote a book called The Leaves of Grass. The leaves of grass are, I contain multitudes, there's everything. This is Gemini, because Gemini can take any two blades of grass and connect them. And Dylan's writing and his songs have that ability to kind of go, doop, 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 doop. Everything gets connected. It's like the switchboard operator. In the olden days, when you made a phone call, the switchboard operator would actually put a plug here and a plug there and connect the two calls, which is what happens digitally now. But that's Gemini, connecting the dots. I don't care if the information's useful. I don't even care if it's true. I've called Geminis the information sluts. They have unlike Virgo, very discriminating. Gemini, when it comes to data, just wants all the data it can get. The next air sign is Libra. And here the data is about the data of me versus you. It's every data has an opposite point. And so in Libra, it becomes the polarities of good and evil, of up and down, of male and female, of yes and no. But those polarities in our lives are basically represented as we go through life in relationship. And I don't mean marriage, although marriage is a Libran affair. I don't even mean only romantic or intimate relationships. I mean every relationship that everything and everyone has with anything and everything else. That's Libra, but it's air. Bucky Fuller, who is actually not an air sign or a Libra, he was actually a Cancer. But he said that thinking was the shortest distance between 2 points, not a straight line, which is the origin of his whole geodesic. A geodesic is based upon straight lines that are the shortest distance between 2 points. That's another story. But thinking is connecting opposites, Libra. And then we get to the third air sign. In Gemini, I'm connecting the thoughts in my own head. In Libra, I'm connecting the thoughts between you and me. And in Aquarius, I'm connecting the most generalized principles of thoughts that have nothing to do, well, everything, but nothing specifically to do with you or me. They are good and evil and light and dark, but not in personal terms. They're in general global humanitarian kind of extended terms. but Aquarius is still about thinking, but it's fixed thinking. And that's interesting because we often think of Aquarius as so innovative and so, well, innovative is a good word, ingenious, but often it's that lightning striking that makes something happen that becomes a fixed thought for that moment. Which brings us to water world. And the water signs are Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. In Cancer, the feelings are internalized. In Cancer, the feelings are about protecting my vulnerability because feelings are mushy. Water flows. Water takes the shape of its container. Water is very different than a quartz crystal. There's nothing flowing about this, at least in our imagination. This is something that is substantial. Substance is a good earth word. It has shape. Water, on the other hand, takes whatever shape that I pour it into, that becomes its shape. In Cancer, it's about protecting the shape of my own water from all the bumping into external realities that I might make. So there's an internalization of Cancer, a self-protecting, a self-nurturing, and that self can include one's child, because the moon related to Cancer is the mother, and the nurturing energy of the mother is a primary expression of one type of love, which is an emotion, which is why Cancer is that motherly love, which can not only extend to your child, but to your family, to your tribe, to your community, to your homeland. And we see the United States of America, born July 4th, 1776, as a perfect example of a Cancer whose homeland needs to be protected. I mean, that's part of what our story is. I mean, it's a much more complicated story. But Cancer is about self-protection. It's about retreating and pulling. I mean, it's a crab which lives in the water. The crab lives in the most nutrient-rich place on the planet because, as you know, living on an island where you can't get very far away from the intertidal zone, the intertidal zone has water washing up and down and up and down every day. Twice a day, the tide comes up and down and up and down. And it's that constant waves of refreshing with nutrients that make the intertidal zone the singularly most nutrient-rich place on the planet. And that's where crabs live. But because it's always changing, crabs live in fear of being washed away by the tides. So what do? Is they grow biologically a hard outer shell to protect themselves from being bounced around in the tides of change. And they know that's not enough. So they take that shell and they find a larger shell of some creature that's no longer using it, and they crawl into that, and now they have real protection against the tides, and they're still afraid of being lost in the tidal flow. So they take their own self and their shell that they've wrapped or that they've crawled into, and they drag the whole thing into a cave or under a rock, and they use it. So they're using these outer shells to protect themselves, just like we use our home or our family to protect ourselves from those larger changes. Mm-hmm. More could be said about that, but enough for now. The next water sign is Scorpio. And in Scorpio, we get to fixed water. Fixed water is very different than flowing water, cardinal water. Water is beginning the new process. Fixed water is like whitewater rapids. The water is moving, but where those rapids are, they don't move. They hold their position no matter what. And so, if you're a whitewater kayaker or canoeist and you go to the same river year in and year out, the intense rapids are going to be in the exact same places, even though depending on the height of the river, the intensity might vary. It's like being in the front of a fire hose. That's not or like being at the bottom of a waterfall. The intensity of the pressure of that water makes it fixed, and there is no fear. I mean, there still may be fear, but there's no fear of its fixed position being lost. Instead, I think is its fear of what happens when it interacts with the environment, what the repercussions are of its holding its own emotion. The third water sign is Pisces, and Pisces being a changeable water sign, I don't want to say it's the least watery of the water signs, but in a way it is, because it's the most diffused. You know, the waters of Pisces, we think of the seas, you know, water, the great waters are the great oceans of the earth, the seas of earth. And Pisces is representative of those seas, but it's not just the seas of earth. It's the seas of consciousness. It's the seas of all the energy that is dispersed throughout the entire universe. And when we talk about Pisces, this is why Pisces can be so confused or confusing. It's why Pisces can be so spiritual. It's why Pisces people can be such brilliant artists and poets and musicians, because they're so lost. And I'm not saying every Pisces is lost, because many find a much wider meaning than the I am this or you are that, in that sense of expanded spirituality, but it's still the waters of consciousness. So that's fire, earth, air, water.
That was amazing. I didn't even know you were going to do that, but that was so good. And it's making me think of the little project we're working on with our beginner chart reading series that you all will learn about soon.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, because I do have some questions on what you just said before we go into like the current astrology and why you're saying water world. Okay. So Jung was the one that had intuition connected with fire, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we don't normally think that way, obviously, in astrology. So,
I do.
Okay. Tell us. So then Aries, Leo, Sag, you would also say those are intuitive.
Oh yeah, signs? With Aries, it's, you know, it's act first, think later. I hate to use this image these days because it's so offensive, but it's shoot first, you know, ask questions later. It's that standard thing of don't let intellect and or emotion get in the way of that absolute moment. That's what Aries is, and that's intuition.
Yeah.
You know, intuition doesn't form a thought or a feeling or doesn't acknowledge a sensation. Intuition just reacts. And if you want someone to react, and obviously every person is different, because even though I am a super Aries, meaning Jeff used to say I carried over the legal limit of planets in Aries, I have a Cancer moon. So, you know, I mean, in other words, we're not just our sign. So there's a part of me that will often hold back. But when I get going, you see that fiery stuff that isn't thinking about what it's saying or even about the ramifications. It's just, and a good Aries word is enthusiasm. And again, as you know, I'm a word geek, and the word enthusiasm actually just means there's no separation between me and God. Because the word enthusiasm means entheos, with God, and so when you're enthusiastic, you're not letting your ego, your perceptions, your ideas, your thoughts, or anything get. When you're enthusiastic, you're channeling something. Aries. Leo is that same kind of direct instinctual thing, but now instead of just doing it in the moment, it's doing something that it can sustain. It's holding a part. It's playing a role. It's theatrical, if you will. It's animated, but it's basically, again, instinctually doing what it does. I think of the boy Leos instinctually, you know, fighting for who's top cat, because that's what boy lions do. While the feminine Leo energy is instinctually just getting on with business and protecting the young, you know, in a different way than the Cancer might do by making a wall and making the young feel protected. The Leo energy is going to go out and actually interact and the Leo is going to do the shopping and to do the hunting. I'm talking about the lioness, the Leo. And so in Leo, the energy is like Aries, but it has to be sustained. In Sagittarius, there's still this intuition, but now it's taking it and expanding it to outer reaches, which become philosophical. I mean, the Sagittarius is the philosopher. It's the adventurer who wants to take those basic, kind of intuitive sense that there's a larger world out there, then it wants to go explore it. So it's those aren't it's not my concept. And I think maybe the best book is there's a book called the Four Elements, the Four Elements and Astrology. Stephen Arroyo. It's a brilliant book for really understanding how astrology is as a system of 12. It's built upon four elements: fire, earth, air, water, and each of them expressing in one of three ways, which we call their modality or mode. And that is by beginning, holding, sustaining the middle, or adapting to what's next. We astrologers call that cardinal, fixed, mutable. Cardinal, the beginning, the initiating. The cardinal signs begin seasons. Aries begins in the northern hemisphere the spring, and Cancer begins the summer, and Libra begins the autumn in the northern hemisphere, and Capricorn begins the winter. And then the fixed signs, which come next, it's cardinal, fixed, mutable. The fixed signs is in Taurus. That's as spring gets. In Leo, that's as summer gets. In Scorpio in the autumn, that's full-fledged autumn. That's not the nice, pretty leaves on the trees. That's the leaves dead and the icy winds coming and the summer being killed. And then in Aquarius, those are the coldest days of winter in many parts of the world. So the fixed signs are the densest of the energies. And then the mutable signs are getting ready for the change, the beginning of the change of what comes next. So the four elements are the basic underpinning of astrology. And we are moving into, and we're already in an area that I'm calling watery for a number of reasons, but we'll get there in just a moment.
Okay. So my next question is about the Myers-Briggs, because you were saying it's based on Jung, which is based on the Greeks, which is, yes. And then astrology is based on the same thing. So would you say that the underpinnings of the Myers-Briggs are essentially astrological?
Astrological with a psychological lean. I mean, there's still there's another couple of elements that have been added, and although I know my Myers-Briggs type and I know I've done some reading on it, I am not the expert on that. But one of the things that it's added to the four elements, because there's really 8 polarities. There's 4 sets of polarities, and so there's one of them is thinking, feeling, Jung 101. One of them is intuiting, perceiving, Jung 101. So then we have the introvert, extrovert, which Jung also worked with, as did Adler, one of Freud's and Jung's, associate contemporaries, whatever. And that's the introvert, extrovert. And then the other is the IP, JI, the judging, perceiving, judging. Which is basically about finality, about how much finality. And a case could be made that those are both earthy, or scales of earthiness or lack of it, because the J is a very Capricorn, Saturnian kind of a thing. And the P, the perceiving on that, is very much a Gemini or Aries, just information. I don't need to make a choice. So yeah, there's a connection, but it's not a one-to-one connection, but it's absolutely there.
Okay. All right. So water world right now.
Water world right now. All right. So when the outer planets move through signs, those elements become important. I mean, we are in this extended phase of the practicality of the structures in which we live, with Jupiter making a 1-year run through Capricorn, Saturn making a 2.5, 3-year run through Capricorn. We've been given a little bit of respite, but Saturn's back into Capricorn pretty quickly here. Saturn will back into Capricorn. I don't have the date in front of me, but I can get it real quick. There it is. Saturn backs into Capricorn on July 2nd, July 1st or 2nd, depending on where you are. And so Saturn being in Capricorn has lent this sense of reality to the earthiness. But then behind all of that, we have Pluto in a roughly 20-year-ish, 18-year stay in Capricorn. And Pluto is about the deconstruction and reconstruction. You know, Pluto is very much, it's not the trigger of rebellion or revolution like Uranus is. But when Uranus strikes, or lightning strikes, because Uranus is lightning, it's Pluto's job to deconstruct that which is not working and to reconstruct something in its place. And so Pluto is nearing the end of its got another few years yet, in Capricorn. And so we have this earthy thing going on where the government, the banks, the roads, the bridges, the institutions of our society, institutions like patriarchy, like racism. These are institutions, and Pluto is doing its job of disintegration or deconstruction so that it can then reintegrate and construct. Like a butterfly is the deconstruction of a caterpillar, and it reconstructs it on a higher level. So that's all said and good. Those are 3 out of 4 of the outer, they're 3 out of 5 of the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. Into this, we have Uranus, which has been moving through Aries and now is in Taurus, which is again keeping us grounded a bit. But where we want to go today is we want to look at sometimes the planet that is left out when astrologers talk about what's going on out there, and that's Neptune, because Neptune is the hardest planet to describe because it's watery. It's the dispersed energies of Pisces, which are infinitely flowing everywhere. In a way, if you think that God is not an old white guy with a beard and a white robe in heaven issuing, executive orders, if you believe that God is everywhere, that's a Pisces function, because Pisces is the seas of energy, the energy of the entire universe that flows through everything and everyone. The true Pisces will acknowledge that there's not a dividing line between what we call life and death. The true Pisces, and if you're a Pisces and don't believe this, it doesn't mean that you're not a true Pisces. I'm talking about the pure energy of form. But the Pisces is basically the true Pisces will say this piece of quartz is fully alive, because everything in the universe has energy flowing through it. It's just alive on a different time scale. It's like a June bug, that lives for 24 hours. That is born and goes through its entire life cycle for 24 hours and then dies. It experiences what we experience in, 60, 70, 90, 100 years in that amount of time. A piece of granite may have a lifetime that extends through hundreds of millions of years, so we don't see it moving and growing and crystallizing and breaking up and being born and dying. Totally different thing. With water flows. And for about 8 years now, 9 years, we've had the planet Neptune in the sign of Pisces. Now Neptune was discovered in the 19th century, mid 1800s, and Neptune of all the planets is the most mysterious. Even though Pluto is farther away, Neptune kind of eludes description. Neptune is the hazy, fuzzy, murky. It's the planet that dissolves the hard edges of Saturn. For example, there's 3 ways that Neptune shows up in the real world. And we're leaning on Neptune right now because Neptune, of all the planets, is maybe the wateriest dispersed to the farthest reaches. I mean, the moon is watery, although it's interesting, the moon itself doesn't have as much water. It's not about how much water the moon has on it. The connection between the moon and the tides and our feelings and menstrual cycles of being on the moon, this is all about energy. This is all about emotions and flowing. Neptune is associated with three substances primarily. Those three substances are the ocean, everything on Earth that is crystalline, including you and me, because we are organic, self-aware, animated, crystalline structures that were actually, like all crystals, grown in a supersaturated, fluid. Whether you're making sugar candy or copper sulfate crystals by supersaturating the solution, meaning warming it up and putting more solids in it and then letting it cool and then seeing the crystals grow. That's basically what we are, except the supersaturated solution is the amniotic fluids inside the womb, inside the sac. And so we are crystals, but all crystals all eventually wash back into the ocean. I mean, it may take eons. It may take eons and eons and eons. But those crystals, whether they're sand on the beach, whether they're earth in our garden, whether they're the refuse that we threw out, everything eventually washes back into the ocean. And even though some of the stuff may take hundreds of thousands of years, like plastic bags floating in remote parts of the Pacific Ocean, eventually that stuff will all be melted down. Melted isn't quite the right word, but will disintegrate until it becomes part of the ocean again. So everything was crystalline. Everything that is crystalline has emerged from the ocean and will wash back into it. By the same token, we all who are in a way crystalline structures that are housing soul, spirit, captured in these meat bodies, those souls or our individual souls are basically part of this. They come from this enormous infinite sea of consciousness, and then they materialize as individuality, and then at death they get washed back into this greater ocean. So when Neptune was discovered, as the newer planets that were discovered through telescope, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, each of those were given to a pre-existing sign that already had a planet associated with it. Uranus, being the first, was given to Aquarius, even though Saturn had been the previous ruler or planet associated with. Neptune was given to Pisces, even though that was Jupiter's domain. And in a way, this is interesting because to the ancients, Jupiter had a lot more feeling than it does to us moderners, because Jupiter not only had the philosophical adventurer side of Sagittarius, but Jupiter also had the belief and the emotional component and the spiritual component of Pisces, which we've now taken away from Jupiter to give to Neptune. And the same would be true with Pluto, having taken away Mars's wet, watery lover side and kind of made Mars into the warrior in Aries. So with Neptune in Pisces, which is in fact to us modern astrologers, that's its home sign, because Pisces and Neptune, even though Jupiter still may be part of that play, it is, that Neptune is most closely defined by its relationship to Pisces, which is this dream world. Neptune is dreams. Pisces is our, a lot of people do say intuition, but they mean it a little bit differently. It's more of an instinct that is built upon the feeling that we have when we get out of the way. When I say we, I mean the Amanda game, the Rick game, the Joe Blow game, the Mary Gardner game, whatever. When the individuals get out of the way, something comes through. And that something may be disincarnate beings, it may be aliens, ghosts, goblins, spirit guides, or wisdom. It doesn't have to be connected to an individual person. And so Pisces has that intuitive side, if you will. But Neptune in Pisces for 14 years is very much like the power animal, if you will, that's driving the wateriness of Pisces. And in some ways, I believe it's the underpinning of why we are living in a world that we can't tell what's real and what's not real, because Pisces once every 163 years moves into its home sign. I'm sorry, Neptune once every 163 years moves back into its home sign of Pisces, and we fall back into this deep what's unconscious, what's conscious, what's reality, what's fake, what's real. And of course, we had during this time, we had the nodal axis moving through Pisces before it backed up, into Aquarius and then Capricorn and now Sagittarius. And so there was this whole sense of that being the setup. Now we move that into the here and now. And what we're dealing with now is we had, going back to March, we had Mercury moving through Pisces and then doing its retrograde dance, so that rather than just Mercury conjuncting with Neptune in Pisces, increasing this, what's going on, what's this virus, is this real, is it a media event? No, it's really killing people. How do I take all these different facts that aren't making sense? Whatever you think is real isn't quite the whole picture. I'm not selling any one point of view here. I'm just saying that much of March was Mercury moving through Pisces. And whenever any planet moves through Pisces these days, including the moon once a month, it's going to not just move through Pisces, it's going to move through Pisces and pick up on Neptune, who's there for 14 years. So we have this undertone that becomes a resonance. And so we had that set up back in March. And then in May and into June, in May, we had Venus making a square with Neptune. Can I put my finger on the dates? Maybe here real quickly I can. Venus squared Neptune. Venus moved into Gemini. Now, Neptune, water, feelings, emotions, tied to the past. Emotions always are flowing. They're always changing. Emotions are never the same. It's the seas that are always, there's always currents, whether we're aware of them or not. Now, the beginning of May, or actually, I guess it was the end of April, Venus moved into Gemini. Actually, April 3rd, Venus moved into Gemini. Venus was way ahead of the sun. And so even though we're in the sign of Aries, Venus is way ahead and touches into Gemini. And it's like, gee, I would really like to know what the facts are. I would really like more information. Venus is what our antenna that kind of say what we like, what we're drawn toward. And the thing about this Venus that went into Gemini the beginning of April, and then it squared Neptune on May 3rd. Gemini, Venus, the idea that more information is good, squared Neptune in Pisces. There's no such thing as real. I think of Neptune as strawberry fields forever. Let me take you down. Nothing is real. Strawberry fields forever. There's this whole idea so when Venus squared Neptune the beginning of May, it all got deeper, because that which we thought, whatever we thought was real, we began wondering, is this really real? And we kind of had to move up into our imagination, because Venus, Neptune together is an attraction towards escaping reality, because reality doesn't seem to exist, and we go into imagination. Venus turned retrograde the end of May 20th. And incidentally, it turns direct next, it turns direct the beginning of next month. No, it turns direct this month in June, actually in a couple of weeks. But it doesn't reach, when Mercury turned retrograde toward the end of May, it went back past that point that was 90 degrees to Neptune again. Normally, these inner planets just make one swing, but because of that Venus retrograde, it squared Neptune, retrograde, squared it again. Now, it turns direct next week. Actually, it turns direct on the 24th of June, but it takes until almost the end of July before it moves forward enough to make that third and final square with Neptune. Now, into this comes the fact that Mars, which spends about 6 weeks in a sign typically, unless it turns retrograde, Mars is now in Neptune also. Mars is fiery. Mars is energetic. Mars is the warrior. It's also the lover. But Mars in Pisces basically can be confused. Who am I fighting against? What am I fighting for? You know, there's this whole sense of lack of clarity. And yet, as I've said here in these conversations recently, Mars in Pisces is also the spiritual warrior, fighting for a higher cause. Today is June 11th. We are recording this. Tonight or tomorrow, depending on where you are on the planet, Mars moving through Pisces makes an exact alignment conjunction with Neptune. Now, Mars moves slowly. We've been feeling this for days. In fact, we also had the full moon eclipse last week, where the sun was 90 degrees to Neptune, the sun in Gemini. And so we're getting this polarity between deluding ourselves with a deluge of information without having the stable data to stand on so we can judge what is true and what is not true. And so this is the dilemma that we're in. And into this, we now have Mars, which has been in Pisces for a few weeks now. Mars now lines up with Neptune, and my guy Grant Louie, who, as you may know or remember, I say it often enough, one of my favorite astrologers, competent, practicing astrologer in the 40s, 50s, early 60s. He wrote Astrology for the Millions, I think in the late 30s. And he was a self-retired, tenured English professor at Colgate College, at Colgate or Dartmouth, at Colgate. And so he was a smart boy. And he called the Mars-Neptune conjunction the shapeshifter, which I always have loved because Neptune is, if Neptune is what you see is not what you get. It's WYSIWYG rather than WYSIWYG. In a computer term, WYSIWYG means what you see is what you get, computers. WYSIWYG is the world we live in. What you see is not what you get. And Neptune basically is that. Now, we have a modern word that we use, that's glamour. And glamour is basically what happens when you put a flower in your hair. It glamorizes you. It's what happens when you put on makeup and when you do what you need to do to look like there's something special about you. We call that glamour, or to glamorize something. Medieval times, the word had a very different meaning. And it was kind of a witchy word that meant conjuring up the spirits to transform you into something different than what you were. And I think we all have this power all the time. We do it unconsciously. Few of us do it consciously, but most of us don't. And you read about some of these references where a diminutive, 4 foot, 8 inch tall woman will change the history of a local village by becoming a 6 foot giant and taking on all the bullshit and kind of becoming larger than life through a series of actions. Now, we've all done this at times unconsciously, but with Neptune, the planet of what you see is not what you get. It's the planet of illusion. and I always have to say here, and I've probably said it here before, is that an illusion isn't necessarily false. An illusion is something that is a product of the unconscious that creates an image that we then can manifest. William Blake wrote, "What is now proved was once only imagined." This is exactly what I mean. I love Caroline Casey, fellow wonderful astrologer, visionary activist. Caroline says that imagination, this is a quote, "Imagination lays the tracks for the reality train to follow." You see, illusions are like the scaffolding that the frontal cortex creates that we then move into and build the buildings of our reality on. So we have to be careful when we go, oh, that's just an illusion. So was an independent United States. So was the 14th Amendment. These were all illusions at one point in time. So was putting a human on the moon. Of course, there are some people who say that's still an illusion. But the point is that we make things up in our mind. That's Neptune. And then we can manifest them. Mars comes along and it gives it energy. It gives it direction. It turns it into a warrior. And I think of an example of someone who had, and I probably need better examples, but someone who has a Mars-Neptune conjunction is Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton's Mars-Neptune conjunction was also conjunct Venus, which made it a little bit trickier and more complicated. But it was the part of him, whether you ever a Clinton fan or foe, is absolutely not the issue here. There was something about him that he had this magic, this charisma. And I know stories of people who hated him, who met him, who were ready to love him just because of the interaction they had. There was something that he had that was that part of that Neptune Mars that energized his ability to manifest the illusion of what he was feeling in that moment to be part of who he was physically. And of course, you add the layer of Venus in there, and then you get all of his other issues that seem to have complicated his presidency and his life, and we don't need to go there, but that's the Venus piece of that. The thing is that on a good day, Clinton was 7 feet tall. On a bad day, it was like he was an ant in the corner of the room. There was something about his physical energy itself that was very Mars-Neptune. Now, with Mars-Neptune in the sky, we are all getting some of that energy, where what our beliefs are, what our illusions are, whether they're true or not, whether they're manifesting or not, they're part of how we're expressing ourselves. But the thing is here that it's I don't want to say devoid, it's not necessarily attached to the facts. Into this mix right now, today, we have the moon, once a month, coming through Pisces, and yesterday the moon moved into Pisces, which means that today, and I'll tell you here what time in just a moment. Today the moon catches up to Mars at, actually it does it tomorrow. I'm sorry, today's the 11th. The moon catches up to Mars tomorrow afternoon, evening in the continental United States, and Neptune just as they're ready to come together to make their exact conjunction, which occurs here in the United States, don't take it personally, but I'm excluding Hawaii because you're a few hours away. But on the east coast of the United States, Mars catches up with Neptune at about 7 o'clock on the morning of June 13th, which would mean that it's right about midnight of the beginning of that day for you, and about 4 in the morning here for me. Now, what that means is that we are in a sweep of not only having Neptune in its own sign, but now having Mars joining Neptune by late Friday night, early Saturday morning, depending upon where you are, and the moon coming into that same place. And all of those have just over the past few days been squared by the sun in Gemini. And on top of that, we still have Venus in Gemini, which is backed away from the square, but by the end of July will come back in again. And the Gemini air square to all those planets in Pisces water makes us a bit crazy because of the deluge. Deluge is a wet word. Deluge is water. And so it's a deluge of too much information, of which we find it difficult to create the stable data or pull the facts out. Now, many people are finding pieces of stable data in this and pulling facts out and building a scaffold, around inclusion and versus racism, or around issues of misogyny versus, again, inclusion versus, issues of how we heal ourselves versus fear versus love, I think is maybe a good, but we can gain so much information that no matter what we know is true, that we become afraid that maybe what we know isn't what we think we know. We begin to question and doubt. And I think question and doubt is good because that's Neptune's realm. Because Neptune dissolves the hard edges of Saturn. Saturn is the delimiting factor between what we know and what we don't know. And when those begin to disintegrate, we then have to go to work. And this is what this whole watery world that we're in is about, is going to work and questioning even those things that we think we know. And again, I don't care what it is you think you know. If you can't put it into a relationship with what the opposite is or what you think you don't know, then in some way you're missing an opportunity. And into all of this comes the planet Mercury, who's just moved into Cancer and is due for a retrograde in Cancer, which is going to reinforce the wateriness of the feelings that we have been unable to express that we're now giving voice to.
Wow. Okay. There's so much there. I mean,
that was Aries enthusiasm, by the way. I just, it happens. Okay, I'll be quiet.
We love it. Okay, so Rick, what do we do with all that? I mean, especially the watery part, because what I got was, the part about question what you think you know, and it's okay to be somewhat doubtful about what you think you know, and to start to incorporate or at least look into other data points to help you understand what you know or don't know. And I've actually been doing that. And one of the things that's so interesting about that is what becomes clear is that the confusion is based on these watery data points. So much of the confusion is based on the data points that differ depending on who you talk to, which is fascinating, actually.
And then confusing.
Exactly. And you see, like, if you took a data point and you built a whole entire storyline around that data point, and then someone might suggest to you that data point is actually something different, you can see why a lot of the conflict is happening between people, because they're actually building these storylines around data points that are totally different from each other. So
which have to do with our individual life experiences often, which can be, as we now know, can be so totally different from one another.
Different and obviously limited because we've only experienced the life we've experienced. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so questioning what we think we know. And so when you were talking about the parts that get confusing again, it seems like the Neptunian higher principles, though, when grounded in those higher principles, it's less confusing. At least I've experienced that myself. When I'm tuned into the bigger concepts that you were talking about, love versus fear, inclusion versus exclusion, when it's easier to see, but
not always, but I agree with you in principle. It's not easier to see when you hear people speaking their heart, saying that why do you get upset when a building is burnt because you haven't listened to our voice for 100 years or more, but you didn't have a voice? I mean, how can you get upset when you tell us to to speak our truth and we do and you don't listen? You tell us to demonstrate peacefully and we kneel and you exclude us for that. We have nowhere to go with this, and we're still being murdered and murdered and murdered again and again and again. How can you blame us when the fact is that the country that you're saying is what we're protecting was built on those same principles of burning someone else's property? I mean, that's the Boston Tea Party was a bunch of terrorists who basically destroyed the property of the country they were living in, of the owners of the country. It was their country. It was England, or the Great Britain. And so it's like, so how can you be angry for us when your country is built on the same thing? Now, I'm not justifying that behavior, although that's where it gets confusing, though, because even the things that we would like to say, that's not a good thing, that's not a good way to go, when we begin to look at more facts, there are things that we would judge as not okay that we go, I don't know how that fits in. I don't know what that does to my thinking. That's all. I didn't mean to jump on that. It's just I'm agreeing that it gets confusing because even those points of data that we know are absolute truth, and again, it's based on different data points. It's based on what the stable piece of data upon which Einstein called it the frame of reference. He said everything in the universe moves and everything has to be mapped with a declared frame of reference. And the problem is that most of us, and I've been guilty too, I've thought my frame of reference was really known. And I have to admit, I'm the first to admit that as a deep and wide history buff who knows probably a lot more about history than most people do, I had amazing, and I still do. I mean, I mean, although I've heard of King Leopold II, I had no idea that King Leopold II killed more Africans than Hitler killed Jews. Now, I have a personal connection to the Hitler killing Jews because that was my tribe. That was my family, some of not my immediate, but close to immediate family. And so I know that story, but where in history are we taught of this guy who had the Congo, which for many years was the Belgian Congo, which wasn't even owned by Belgium. He gave it to Belgium later in his life, but it was his own playground for wealth. And I mean, there's stories, the documents that have come out from that period of his troops going in and cutting the hands and feet off of a 5-year-old daughter, and then murdering that person's wife, and then cutting them up and putting them in that person's personal space so that person would be fearful and obey every rule. Where do we hear about this? So all I'm saying is I'm just saying even our stable frames of reference are right now, if we're paying attention, are being shaken. Mine too. And I'm the first to go there and admit that I've spent a lot of time over these past week or so just soaking it in, trying to set aside what I thought I knew to be true. That's all I can say.
And one of the things you've brought up consistently over the last few weeks and months is this: how do we know what we think we know? Where did we get the information? How was the information filtered? What lens was reporting the information? And one of the things we've been talking about within our team at Astrology Hub is, Erica, who I did the podcast with last week, keeps saying,
and I heartily recommend, if anyone hasn't watched that, go watch that. Erica, you are amazing. And Amanda, just for giving that voice, my kudos to you too. But it's just another data point. I'm not making less of it, but there's so many people right now that I'm listening to with stories like that we've just never heard before, because
we never heard them.
Didn't have voices.
Exactly. And she's saying,
shame is an issue here. They didn't have voices because they were afraid they would be cast out.
Oh,
if
yeah.
they brought that up. And that works on both sides of the coin. I mean, that's
Yes.
not just about, and I'm not making less of Black Lives Matter, but this is not just about Black lives that are Black people who don't have voices. This is about people who don't have voices. We saw a first wave of this come up in the, in the Donald Trump pussy grabbing scenario, where people were willing to say, well, it's okay, he's my guy, but I'm going to just let that go. That's a judgment. But when the whole Me Too movement became like the person of the year, that made a statement, and the statement, it's different, but the same as what's going on now, because the statement has to do with disenfranchised people not having a voice and being shamed into their position rather than being heard and acknowledged for what their position is.
Totally, Rick. And yes, and those voices need to be heard. What I'm always like aware of or cautious about is the shame actually going the other side. Like there's the shame because, for example, I have this beautiful brother who works at a school. He's so huge-hearted and amorous, and yet he says he no longer feels comfortable complimenting a woman on her dress, like, oh, I love your dress, or oh, your hair looks great today,
Yeah.
because of the backlash that might happen. And to me, that's like everybody loses there. Everybody loses there. So there's this giving a voice, and oh man, it's tricky, but it really can, and maybe it sometimes needs to swing the other direction for a little bit, and then so it comes back where everybody's feeling honored and heard and seen, and we can just be human together. We can be human without these boundaries between us. But it is
yes. Complimenting someone on their dress would not be a big deal if it wasn't in a context that it's in, which may have nothing to do with the individual or the individual's intentions, although it may, and we never know, but it's always in a larger context. And so, there's definitely some stuff going on there. I mean, even with that, I reframed and looked at a whole lot of my behaviors, and I don't want to go too deep into that here. It's just that if these things are not having impact on you, if you're saying, well, yeah, but that's not me, then you're not informing yourself enough. And again, I'm not saying what your outcome or what your position should be. However, I am saying that if you're not at least listening to the points of view that are not yours, keep your judgment. Ultimately, that's your judgment. Keep your opinion. Ultimately, that's your opinion. But at least listen to the voices that are not being heard. And you'd say that goes with your brother. That goes on both. That goes for someone who is afraid to admit that they either really didn't like or really did like the reign of Barack Obama or George Bush or Richard Nixon, or I mean whatever, or it doesn't matter who, Clinton or Trump. It's not about that, because it's about the context that falls in, and the feeling that people are therefore ashamed to state their position for fear of judgment by whatever the community is that's holding an opposite perspective.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy question.
No, and what I'm getting, like, as you're speaking, this is coming, and it's not a fully like formed idea, but I think anytime we're going to all blank are blank, all men are blank, all cops are blank, all Black people are blank, all women,
Protesters, all
all
protesters.
protesters are blank. That's
all Trump voters are blank.
All Trump voters are blank. All Clinton voters are blank. Whatever it is, all blank are blank.
God, we have a nation of blanks.
We have a nation of blanks. That seems like a trap to me. Any way we look at it, that's going to be by virtue of what it is, because it could never be true. It could never be true. It's going to be excluding very, very important data for us to be able to really do what Erica was talking about last week, which is creating bridges of understanding and compassion and empathy with each other.
So where do we go from here?
So we're in watery territory.
Well, and within watery territory, there's a danger, especially with Mars conjunct Neptune. And with Mars conjunct Neptune, I can get so fired up with my belief that I do something that is irrational. Now, there are times for irrational action because irrational just means that you don't have reasoning to support it, but your reasoning and my reasoning may not be the same reasoning.
Right.
So, and so we have people taking actions that someone might say, it's irrational for Donald Trump to have meetings where there are all these, white guys getting together in a close situation without wearing masks. That may be to some people irrational. To someone else, that might be, well, they're trying to portray an image of calmness in a nation which needs to blah, blah, blah. I mean, so we have to be careful. But the same token, by someone, someone can rationalize anything. And when Mars is conjunct Neptune, as it is now, even with the moon there also, with planets in Gemini squaring it, we can get so worked up that we take action. Action is necessary now for whatever, whatever you need to do. We all need to be not quiet. We all need to be doing something. But we can get so worked up that the Mars kicks in and we overinflate or over-energize or misplace our anger. I mean, that's what Mars is, anger. Mars is the angry red planet. And it's easy, instead of asserting, to aggress in ways that actually are not useful for our cause. And where those boundaries are, I can't really tell you. They're not. It's not me to say which boundaries are right or wrong. I can only do that for me, and I can only observe that Mars and Neptune together makes those boundaries a little bit fuzzier and a little bit hotter, a little bit more fiery, and a little bit angrier.
All right. So what would you say to people who are, there's so much going on, and there's just,
listen, 50% of communication, what's that old saying, is we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should listen twice as much as we talk. Right now, don't be the first to go out and tell everybody what you're doing and what you're thinking and blah, 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 blah. I know it seems like I'm doing that here to some extent. I just have to say, I've spent more time in the last week or so absorbing information that I have in a long, long time, not the information that I would normally absorb about astrology transits or philosophy or this or that. But I would say, listen, absorb. That's what water does. Professor Emoto's, the magic, of water, the miracle is that water actually, even though it takes the shape of its container, water also takes the shape invisibly of the emotions that are felt around it. And so we need to be like water, and we need to feel what we're feeling. And we need to be aware, though, that regardless of what binary division you fall upon, how you identify, and I don't mean gender here, I mean whether you define yourself as someone who listens to MSNBC or to Fox, you have to understand that all information that's coming to you through any media has a bias, just like something from me. And from that standpoint, I think it's important that we also sit back and listen to the inner voice. Now we're going back to the real meaning of Pisces, is not being distracted by the ego's involvement in the seas of consciousness, but to actually meditate or pray or sit, whatever you want to call it, but to actually be quiet. And quite frankly, and I don't know that people have talked about this much, but in a way, if this virus, I'm saying if this virus was a man-made virus and a bioweapon, if there's an alternate agenda here for controlling us through, implantations, vaccines, if there is something here about, you know, the need to use martial law to control people and the need to have guns so that we can keep the military away. If, I'm not saying any, I'm just saying all the ifs that are circulating out there, if you're paying attention. If you're paying attention, and all of those ifs that are out there, whatever if it is that you believe, the person who stands to gain the most from that if, whether you think it's Donald Trump, the Illuminati, whether you think it's Bill Gates, whether you think it's the pharmaceutical industry, whether you think it's the military industrial complex, whether you think it's the blacks reclaiming their birth, whatever it is, here's the thing. No one is left in control. I don't care what your story is, things have gotten to a place where there is no one running the show. Now, on one hand, that is fully frightening. That is Neptune at its greatest, because Neptune is the murkiness, it's the unknown, it's the fear of not knowing when the structures have disintegrated. On the other hand, it's also the moment of the greatest potential, and that's the higher side of Neptune, and that's using the spiritual, the imagination, the love, the agape love of connection, not to go into denial about what's going on, but to create a higher arching structure for it to solidify on. And I would say this, I would say that whatever the narrative is that you think might have gotten us to here, this has become a perfect storm where if we hadn't had 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 weeks of quietness, I know not for everyone. There are people who have been going to work double time during this, but for a lot of the people, the isolation, the quarantine, the self-quarantining that went along with that still go along with the COVID-19 fear that incidentally, I mean, in the midst of all of this, no one's talking about that because everyone's talking about the largest singular sustained worldwide protest. And protest is not riot. Protest means to protest, just like the entire Protestant Reformation was a protest against the authoritative practices of the church, meaning of Rome. And the single thing that they were protesting, well, there are many, but the most important thing they were protesting was something not a whole lot different than now. They were protesting the fact that wealthy people could buy indulgences and therefore not go to hell because they could buy their way out of hell. That's how the church was supporting itself, through wealthy contributions by people who were buying indulgences, while those people who were disenfranchised, those people without a voice, those people created what we call the Protestant Reformation. We think of it as the Protestant Reformation, but that's what's going on right now. And incidentally and importantly, that happened at the previous time Saturn and Pluto were conjoined in the sign of Capricorn. That was in 1517, the end of 1517, within a couple of months of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in January of 1518. And that's what we're experiencing right now.
You know, Rick, I've noticed recently, and again, in this quest to really understand multiple perspectives, one of the things I've observed is that the people that I'm in contact with that seem the most afraid and the most confused, like just unable to decipher really what's happening, which everybody at some point, at some level is, right?
Yeah.
But like really paralyzed by that. Let me just say that. Seem to be the ones that have the least connection with that inner voice, the least, access to it, which has actually given me another level of compassion, because it's like, oh God, I have a compass in me that I sometimes take for granted that I think everybody has, and not everybody has it. And so this, what you're saying, first listen to each other with the intention to actually learn and to really like absorb, but also to listen to that inner voice and continue cultivating that, and maybe even encourage others back to that place as much as possible too, because we forget sometimes that not everybody has access to that, but everybody does, but not everybody has practiced it or cultivated it.
The very first time you and I got together in this format and talked, it was pre this current situation,
Right.
but it was in the midst of the pandemic.
Right.
And there was, and I had mentioned in that conversation something that I still believe, and you just voiced it from a different perspective. And that was that there are so many people who we would consider in our tribe, in our perspective of how we see things, that are looking at this as the great pause, the great awakening, that this is something's going on, that this is the moment in which we can move closer to utopia or the perfect, and that as this continues to unfold, that more and more people would be confronted with what's going on and wake up. And I said to that only happens when people get confronted with more information. That only happens to that wake up process only happens to some people, because other people confronted with the same information push further into denial. They're not doing it consciously, and they can be entirely good people, whatever that means. Well-intended is maybe a better word, because denial is not something that we're conscious of. It's not suppression where we're doing it out of fear and we're holding it down, although some people may be doing that. It's a totally invisible thing. And so as more and more Gemini information comes out and up and people are overloaded, some people can find ways to incorporate some of that information. And yet some people who don't have an internal compass, who basically have bought an external authoritative feed, whether that comes to them through politics or religion or family values or nationality or whatever, some of those people might have a harder and harder time accessing it, because the Cancerian walls, and I mean Cancer, the sign, not the disease, the Cancerian walls of protection get thicker and thicker, and they're not even aware of it. So that's really what you said from a different point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, I think the three takeaways are where you left us, which was listen. That has several levels, right?
Yes.
Feel. We didn't talk too much about that, because that actually is
But
another
that's
thing.
water. That is underlying everything.
Yes.
And that's the denial thing that you were talking about, that I readdressed also, is that whatever it is you're feeling, whether you're feeling love or hope or anger or sadness or guilt or shame or this or that, I mean, and if you're paying attention, you're probably feeling a panoply, is that the right word?
Panacea?
Huh?
Panacea?
No, a spread, a wide spread
Yeah.
of all of these feelings. I mean, you can feel optimistic and totally discouraged and pessimistic at the same time. Feelings don't have to be mutually exclusive. And yes, number 2 is feel the feelings.
Yeah.
That's part of meditation. Part of meditation is I don't have to unconsciously react to every feeling I have. I just let them come through and I say, I am having this feelings. Feelings are something that flow through the body. And if I can observe them, and if I can feel them, and if I can experience them, they will flow through, they will transform into something else. And my job is to simply let them flow without blocking, because as soon as I take a feeling and push it away, or as soon as I take a feeling and grab it, that then turns it into something else.
Totally. And it's
Number 3.
another it's another
Sorry.
skill set we don't learn too much about in school, is
Yeah.
like how to actually feel. And let me just say real quick, I know we have to go, but the willingness to feel is what enabled that podcast episode 110 last week with Erica, because we were on the team meeting and people were feeling things and giving voice to it and being okay with, like, I feel uncomfortable asking this question, or I feel ashamed that I didn't know, or whatever it was. It enabled this. Whoa! It was alchemy. It was magic.
And again, if you haven't seen it, go watch it. What is it?
110. I think it's episode 110. Yeah, with Erica. Okay.
So one is listening. 2 is feeling.
3 is absorb.
Yeah, well, that's part of feeling, but I think the absorbing is a combination of 1 and 2, and then regardless if it works with what your beliefs are, at least bring it into the system enough so that you can understand the multiplicity of perception. It's about bridge building. You can't build a bridge between here and there unless you understand what here and there are.
Totally. Yes. Rick, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Love this. Look forward to it every week. And I know so many people in the audience do as well. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for that lesson and all the signs in the beginning. That was a
My
bonus.
pleasure. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't remind people they could read my daily updates on Instagram at Rick Levine Astrologer. And there's a daily little blurb about what's going on day by day that I think goes beyond many of the daily horoscope things, but it doesn't take hours to read.
It's awesome. Love, love, love it. Check it out. And then for those of you who want to join us for the free solstice panel that we're hosting next week, this is going to be 7 astrologers talking about the solstice eclipse. This solstice being Gemini Brett saying the most important, not only Gemini Brett, a lot of astrologers saying this is.
I'm saying it too. And incidentally, we didn't bring this up earlier, but the fact of the matter is that eclipse, which is an annular eclipse, it's a special variety of a total eclipse. That eclipse is happening at 0 degrees of Cancer, which again is water. It's the beginning of the season.
Water.
That's another whole thing. It's a cardinal point. But just in the larger discussion we've had of water, this eclipse is incredibly potent because of that too.
Okay, awesome. So that is astrologyhub.com/solstice. We'll be talking about the solstice. We'll be talking about the rest of the year. I always love the panels because the astrologers talk to each other and they build off each other, and it's always very exciting. So that's next Wednesday. On Friday, on the actual day of the solstice eclipse, we are going to be coming together, Gemini Brett, Tammy Brunk, myself, and leading ceremony for that actual moment, which we have found to be extraordinarily powerful. Yeah. And one thing, Rick, I'm noticing about eclipses is, and this is just totally anecdotal from my one little vantage point, but when I meet the eclipse energy with a radically open heart, it is extraordinarily catalytic in a great way. It can be intense, but it's new ground is formed beneath my feet. It's really amazing. So anyways, we'll be coming together for that eclipse. astrologyhub.com/solstice. All right, everybody, take care. Can't wait to connect with you all again next week. Rick, you're awesome. Thank you for being here, and take care. Aloha, everybody.